You are listening to Death and Diamonds, research written and narrated by Mark Felton. Episode 1. British soldiers, their camouflage uniforms filthy with dirt and sweat, hands tied behind them, knelt in the village dirt as rifles were levelled at their backs by mostly teenage African rebels. An order was given to fire. The rebels, high on drugs and rot-gut liquor, laughed as the only sound was the dry click of rifle bolts and empty weapons. The execution may have been mock, but the intention to kill the helpless hostages was very real. Sweating profusely, the bruised and battered British soldiers were hauled back to the hut that served as their prison by their highly animated and crazed guards to spend the rest of the day wondering how long their nightmare would last. Unknown to the soldiers, friendly eyes had witnessed the mock execution from concealed positions inside the thick green jungle that bordered the tiny village, and, even as the hostages were dragged off, English voices were quietly relaying the news of this latest outrage back to London. The wheels of a rescue plan were already turning. Sierra Leone, a small West African country famous for diamonds, was in a serious state of disorder by 2000. With its fertile soil and immense mineral wealth, Sierra Leone should have been one of the richest nations in Africa, but by 2000 it was listed by the United Nations as the world's poorest country and one of the most dangerous. The life expectancy for men was only 36 years. The former British colony, which had gained independence in 1961, had descended into a state of near anarchy, with the established government under concerted rebel attacks and crime and lawlessness rife on the streets of the capital, Freetown, and throughout the country. The problems had begun in 1996, when the presidential and legislative elections had been severely marred by widespread rigging in favour of the Sierra Leone People's Party, the SLPP. International monitors had, however, declared that the elections had been largely fair and free, despite the violent tactics employed by Foday Sanko's Revolutionary United Front, or RUF guerrillas. On the 25th of May 1997, a military coup was staged that deposed President Ahmed Tejan Kaba. But the resulting junta was not popular with the people of Sierra Leone. And in February 1998, the junta was in turn removed by Nigerian-led Economic Community of West African States Monitoring Group, or ECOMOG forces, aided by the Sierra Leone Civil Defense Forces. In March 1998, President Kaba was restored to power. The resumption of power by Kaba did not bring stability to the small nation of 4.8 million people. RUF attacks continued, and by the 6th of January 1999, the rebel militias had captured most of the capital, Freetown, and appeared poised to take control of the government. This was only prevented by ECOMOG forces that battled with the RUF in the streets of the capital and eventually forced them back into the jungle. Some 5,000 people died from the fighting. In May 1999, a ceasefire was declared, and in July, the Lomé peace agreement appeared to herald an end to the bloody fighting that had resulted in the deaths of over 75,000 people throughout Sierra Leone. The agreement granted blanket amnesties to all those suspected of having committed war crimes. The ceasefire would be monitored, humanitarian assistance would be provided, and 4 cabinet posts created for the RUF as part of a power-sharing agreement. In May 2000, the ceasefire dissolved when Codé's RUF launched a concerted drive on the capital. They also made the mistake of taking hostage 500 UN peacekeeping troops who were monitoring the ceasefire and murdering some UN personnel and foreign journalists. The RUF also stepped up attacks on neighbouring Guinea. The international community was compelled to act. By late 2000, there were 13,000 UN peacekeepers protecting Freetown and the key towns in the south of the country, and some British observers. After a British officer was taken hostage, Prime Minister Tony Blair authorised the activation of Operation Palliser. in which Britain determined to restore peace and democracy to her former colony by force if necessary. The job of the British forces was initially to secure Freetown Airport so that British, European Union and Commonwealth citizens could be evacuated and allow UN reinforcements to enter the country. To this end, the 1st Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, deployed on the 7th of May to Senegal, and the following day seized Freetown Airport and began evacuating British civilians. The Paras formed the spearhead battalion for the new British Rapid Reaction Force, and they would be supported by the Royal Navy's Amphibious Ready Group that was ordered to steam to Sierra Leone from Marseille, where it had been deployed in the Mediterranean. The ARG consisted of the helicopter carrier HMS Ocean, which was carrying 10 helicopters and the 600 men of 42 Commando Royal Marines. Air cover was provided by the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious, which had aboard 7 Fleet Air Arm Sea Harriers and 7 Harrier GR-7s from the Royal Air Force, the frigate HMS Chatham, supported by the supply ship RFA Fort Austin and 2 RFA logistic landing ships. Brigadier David Richards took overall command of the Paras battle group that deployed ashore. Operation Palliser represented the largest British military deployment since the 1991 Gulf War. Within days, the evacuation of 299 British nationals had been completed, and the Paras extended their mission to patrolling the streets of Freetown and providing logistical support to government forces and loyal militias, backed up by elements of D Squadron 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, the SAS, who, when questioned about their unit by reporters, replied that they were members of the Hereford Walking Club. Preventing the RUF from taking control of Sierra Leone was vital. The RUF traded diamonds from the extensive mines dotted across the nation for arms. The $100 million a year trade in blood diamonds helped to fund the Islamic terrorist groups known collectively as Al-Qaeda, who were the main supplier of weapons to the RUF. On the 17th of May, the British faced their first test when an RUF militia launched an attack on the airport. Members of 29 Commando Regiment Royal Artillery, working alongside Nigerian troops, fought off the RUF in a fierce 10-minute gunfight that left 4 rebels dead. Later that day, a British helicopter transported captured RUF leader Sanko to a secure location. 20 Commando Battery Royal Artillery also saw action on Pepel Island, close to the capital, capturing 15 rebels, along with a quantity of heavy weapons. One Paras Pathfinder platoon was also assaulted by rebels, but the elite airborne soldiers killed 20 of them for no British loss. Soon afterwards, the 1st Battalion Royal Irish Regiment deployed to Sierra Leone and relieved the 2nd Battalion Royal Anglian Regiment on the 22nd of July. The Royal Irish began to patrol along the front line. It was a patrol from this regiment that triggered a large-scale battle between the SAS and Paras on the one hand and the RUF on the other. Some days before the first shots were exchanged in anger between the RUF and British forces, some British officers who had been captured while on UN monitoring duties had staged a dramatic escape from captivity in a bid for freedom from highly unpredictable and unpleasant captors. Many British and Commonwealth military officers had been working with the UN, assisting and overseeing the disarming of the rebels, when they had suddenly discovered themselves prisoners. The RUF had not hesitated earlier to murder UN personnel, and those British officers held hostage genuinely feared for their lives, trapped a long way from friendly forces and surrounded by hostile jungle swarming with trigger-happy rebels. One such unfortunate was Major Philip Ashby of the Royal Marines. Phil Ashby was an ideal soldier, in fact rather an all-action hero. A Scotsman from Helensburgh, he was a tough, fit, experienced and very determined man, with a healthy streak of aggression honed to a fine point by his extensive commando training. Ashby was 30 years old in 2000. He had joined the Royal Marines at the age of 17 and a half and been commissioned a second lieutenant, becoming the youngest commissioned officer in the forces. He was sponsored to attend Pembroke College, Cambridge. and by the time he found himself an RUF prisoner in Sierra Leone, had served in Alaska, Brunei, Belize, Cyprus, Hong Kong, Northern Ireland and Norway. Ashby had climbed all over the world and survived an epic two-man rowing competition in the Arctic Ocean, which had seen the two men row 1,000 miles and complete the only human circumnavigation of the Norwegian island of Spitsbergen. Ashby had survived being trapped in the ice, a polar bear attack, hurricane-force winds and capsizing in the freezing water. He was a Royal Marine mountain leader, having passed the longest and hardest specialist infantry course in the forces, and served in the mountain and Arctic warfare cadre, and in 1999 he had been promoted to major at the age of only 28, once again being the youngest to hold this rank in the armed forces. To add to his long list of military achievements, Ashby had qualified as a jungle instructor. On top of all this action, Ashby had also found the time to obtain a master's degree in defence technology from Cambridge University. Ashby and his companions were held hostage in a compound in the small town of Makeni in northern Sierra Leone. They were being held with a party of poorly armed Kenyan UN peacekeepers. Alongside Ashby were Captain Andrew Samsonov of the Light Infantry, Lieutenant Commander Paul Rowland of the Royal Naval Reserve, and Major David Lingard, a New Zealander. Ashby and his comrades had decided that it was stupid to just sit in captivity waiting for whatever it was the rebels had planned for them, and they suspected a bullet could well be the result. The party had suffered 4 days of physical and psychological bombardment from their captors that had included the throwing of the blood-stained uniforms of their fellow UN workers over the compound walls to try and frighten them. Ashby, with his extensive training and experience of hostile environments and survival training, was the obvious man to lead them to safety. They decided to head for the UN compound at Magburaka, where RUF control was patchy. They had the uniforms they stood up in and a satellite phone that they had managed to hide from the rebels, but little else with which to take to the jungle with. It would require several days of trekking through thick jungle, and once their presence was missed at Makeni, RUF patrols would also be hunting them, with orders to shoot first and ask questions later. Magburaka was south from Makeni, and moving in that direction would also place them closer to British forces in Freetown. A helicopter rescue could then be attempted. The satellite phone was Ashby's and his colleagues' only lifeline to a speedy rescue. At 2:45 a.m., with their faces blackened with charcoal, Ashby and his companions carefully scaled the compound wall in a bid for freedom. As he recalled, jumping over the wall felt like standing on top of a high diving board, only 50% sure that there was actually any water in the pool underneath. For the first few hours the adrenaline was pumping, and we were very relieved to actually get out of a deadly, bustling market town, which in the middle of night, with an RUF curfew imposed, it was fair to assume that anyone we saw on the streets was actually in the RUF. Working their way stealthily past RUF patrols and people in the streets was very difficult. We saw several people on the way out, recalled Ashby. Once clear of Makeni, Ashby and his comrades dived into the jungle and scrub. They moved initially only by night in order to lessen the chances of running into the RUF, who were searching for them. We were sleeping in the biggest thickets we could find so that nobody would be able to find us during the day, said Ashby. Our main problem was lack of water. It's still the dry season here, and although there were several rivers marked on our maps, what in practice we were hoping for was some large jungle rivers that were in fact pools of stagnant water. Ashby and his companions had no choice but to drink this foul standing water, in the process risking a plethora of diseases. As he said, "So we've been drinking unusually coloured water, shall we say, but it was enough to keep us going." At night time the men, lacking mosquito nets, were assailed by biting insects, and by day they were burned by the harsh sun and suffered prickly heat, as well as cuts, bruises and scratches, as they fought their way through the unfamiliar and difficult landscape. Always present was the fear of running into a heavily armed RUF patrol, and the fear that any injury could have resulted in being recaptured and facing the consequences of their decision to cut and run. After 3 days of living on their nerves and drinking filthy water, Ashby's parties stumbled upon a group of Guinean peacekeepers near the town of Magburaka. Although Ashby still had the satellite phone and had been able to speak to British forces shortly after his escape from Makeni, a problem had arisen. "They had a satellite phone, so we knew they were on their way," said Lieutenant Tony Camp, the British HQ in Freetown, but the battery packed up after 24 hours. However, the Guinean soldiers took them to the local town, from where they were able to summon help. A helicopter was duly dispatched to pick up Ashby and his men, who were flown out to RFA Sir Percival for medical treatment after their jungle odyssey. They were covered in insect bites, suffering from prickly heat and sunburn, and covered in bruises and cuts. Otherwise, they considered themselves very lucky to have managed to walk out of RUF-controlled territory without being killed or recaptured. For his tremendous leadership, fortitude and daring, Major Ashby was awarded the Queen's Gallantry Medal. The Sierra Leone jungle was not quite through with Major Ashby, for soon after arriving back in Britain he collapsed and discovered that he was paralysed from the waist down. Although movement came back to his lower limbs, Ashby has had to cope with long-term disability caused by a tropical parasite that he picked up during the trek through the jungle to freedom. No sooner had the saga of Ashby and his colleagues been solved than another group of British soldiers found themselves in dire straits. A 10-man patrol from the Royal Irish Regiment, travelling in 2 Land Rovers, strayed a bit too far into territory in the Ochre Hills, controlled by a lawless band of 300 drug-taking and trigger-happy militia associated with the RUF known as the West Side Boys, who were led by Fode Calais. About 200 members of the Royal Irish were supporting Sierra Leone forces as advisors and training instructors, and their patrol had with them a liaison officer from the local defence force. The British soldiers, under the command of Major Alan Marshall and their Sierra Leonean colleague Lieutenant Musa Bangura, had been beaten up and thrown into a rudimentary jail located in a dirty little village on the bank of Rokel Creek, deep in the thick jungle of the hinterland. Marshall came in for some criticism from his superiors for having allowed himself and his patrol to be captured, but he was using his initiative and had gone to check out 2 villages in his role as an intelligence gatherer. It was a calculated risk taken by Marshall that had sadly backfired and resulted in his men's capture by the West Side Boys. Calais knew that the British soldiers were valuable to him, so he spared their lives and would attempt to ransom them. In the meantime, Lieutenant Bangura, as a Sierra Leonean, was extensively tortured and abused by the West Side Boys and imprisoned separately in a deep hole covered by corrugated iron which the rebels used as an ad hoc latrine. The village was called Gibiri Bana and consisted of about 20 ramshackle huts and breeze-block structures built on the north bank of the river. Around 150 heavily armed West Side Boys were in residence. 1.5 miles along Rokel Creek and on its south bank was another village, Magbeni, containing a further 100 West Side Boys. They had sufficient machine guns and mortars to cover Gibiri Bana, and they had in place 4 14.5mm heavy machine guns around Magbeni for this purpose. On the 3rd of September, Calais released 5 of the British soldiers in exchange for a satellite phone and some medical supplies, but further negotiations soon broke down, and Calais threatened to shoot the remaining hostages. After Major Marshall refused to obey Calais' instructions to call the BBC on the phone, the rebel leader staged a mock execution of the remaining hostages, and it was clear that he might be induced to carry out a real execution within days. It became clear that Calais had no intention of releasing the men, said a British government spokesman. That view was borne out after the raid. The hostages later told us that they were sure they would be executed if we did not rescue them. There was no way they were going to be allowed to walk free. Unbeknown to Marshall or the rebels, Giberi Bana was under close observation from teams from Britain's crack SAS. The SAS had been inserted some days beforehand and had carried out a detailed reconnaissance of both rebel villages, including locating the remaining hostages and carefully recording the conversations of Calais and the other rebels with special microphones. Based on what the SAS had seen and heard, Tony Blair, acting on the advice of his military commanders, authorized Operation Barras, the rescue of the hostages by a special assault force of paras and SAS. The SAS team on the ground was ordered to prevent the West Side Boys from executing the prisoners, while the British military in Freetown put together an assault force. Observation teams from D Squadron, 22 SAS, spent 2 weeks in the jungle close to Giberi Bana, observing rebel activities around the hostage house from positions to the north. Across the river to the south, elements of the Royal Marines Special Boat Service, the SBS, did the same. Shortly after 6 a.m. on the 10th of September, the SAS moved into the northern part of Giberi Bana and began to engage the rebels. Simultaneously, SBS frogmen silently crossed the river and infiltrated into the village from the south. Shortly after, 2 Lynx gunships moved up Rokel Creek low and fast with orders to attack the rebels' heavy weapons positions that had been located by the SAS. Muhammad Kamara, one of the West Side Boys at Giberi Bana village, looked up at the sudden roar of helicopters at first light. Within seconds, the thump of the rotor blades was joined by a cacophony of explosions and bursts of machine gun fire as the gunships began to engage targets on the ground. The helicopters were almost on the water, recalled Kamara. They fired again and again until there was no more shooting. Once the Lynx gunships had liberally plastered all the known rebel fixed positions, the troop-carrying helicopters arrived. At 6:16 a.m., 3 giant twin-rotor Chinook helicopters headed for Rokel Creek. Aboard were 147 paras and several dozen SAS, armed to the teeth and raring to go. Alongside the fighting troops was a field surgical team from 1/6 Close Support Medical Regiment, Royal Army Medical Corps, and 3 members of the RAF's Tactical Communications Wing. Another Lynx helicopter from HMS Chatham joined the force as it headed inland, the helicopters having been fitted with door-mounted machine guns to provide fire support over the target. The plan called for 1 Chinook carrying 45 paras to put down 1/3 of a mile west of Magbeni. The other 2 Chinooks would land next to the house in Giberi Bana where the hostages were being held and in a clearing slightly north of the village respectively. The downblast as the Chinooks dropped altitude to allow the troops to get off was powerful enough to rip the corrugated iron roofs off the village huts. At the same time as this was happening, SAS and SBS troops opened fire on the huts, blasting them with grenade launchers and automatic fire. At Magbeni, the paras jumped from the tail ramp of the Chinook straight into a deep swamp. We waded chest deep through the swamp to the objective, recalled 30-year-old Captain Liam Cradden, the Deputy Assault Commander. As soon as Calais heard the approach of helicopters, he knew that the game was up. Thinking that he had nothing left to lose, he ordered his men to kill Major Marshall and the other hostages. Tune in next time to find out whether the paras and SAS will successfully capture the village and save the hostages before it is too late. You have been listening to Death and Diamonds, written and presented by Mark Felton. For many short history documentaries on a wide variety of subjects, visit my other YouTube channel, Mark Felton Productions, details below. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details again in the description box below.